without limits or judgment. A place for you and people like you to tell your most effed up stories. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Effed Up Stories. I'm your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight we will be discussing the mysterious Men in Black with special guest Nick Redfern. Nick Redfern is the author of more than 20 books on UFOs, Bigfoot, lake monsters, the Chupacabra, the Hollywood scandal, including Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, Celebrity Secrets, There's Something in the Woods, Contactees, Final Events, The Real Men in Black, The NASA Conspiracies, Science Fiction Secrets, On the Trail of the Saucer Spies, Strange Secrets, and with fellow Texas-based researcher and author Ken Gerhard, Monsters of Texas. Nick has appeared on more than 70 TV shows, including Fox News, the BBC's Out of This World, the Sci-Fi Channel's Proof Positive, the History Channel's Monster Quest, America's Book of Secrets, Ancient Aliens, and UFO Hunters, the National Geographic Channel's Paranatural, and MSNBC's Countdown with Keith Olbermann. Nick can be contacted at his website, or his blog, I should say, at http://nickredfern14.blogspot.com. But before we dive into the Men in Black phenomenon, some news. If you haven't been to our official website lately, or at all, go there now and bookmark it. The address is www.effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. Again, that's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. I finally had the website fully redesigned and online. It has all of our podcasts, plus paranormal stories, pics, videos, and more. It also now features a simple submission form that will let you quickly and easily submit your own effed up stories, pics, videos, questions, and podcast topics. And of course, by doing so, you can get your content on our site and or in a podcast, and possibly even invited onto our show to be a guest. And with that having been said, let me introduce you to a scary notion. Just by listening to this podcast, you could be being watched right now. Sound crazy? Well, hold that thought until the end of the show. For now, I'd like to welcome our guest for this evening. Hello, Nick, and thanks for joining us on the show.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure. So, Nick, to start this off, for all of our listeners out there, can you just define exactly what the Men in Black are?
Yeah, sure. I guess before I define what they are, I can say what they're not, and that's sort of real-life equivalents of Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith. You know, that's sort of the public perception that people have of the Men in Black, largely derived from the movies, that these are sort of government people whose job it is to silence people who've seen UFOs. Now, there's no doubt that a small category of men in black do seem to fall into that particular brand, if you like. We do know that government agencies have taken an interest and sort of watched and surveyed people in the field, and also witnesses as well to UFO activity. But when you dig into the sort of the deeper complexities of the whole Men in Black mystery, you find that the real ones are, I guess, sort of far weirder and creepy and almost sort of ghoulish and vampire-like. You know, they're sort of creepy little guys with pale skin who sort of turn up after the sun set and make these veiled threats, which, you know, are sort of more sinister and paranormal based than, you know, anything that could ever come out of the CIA or the FBI.
So there seems to, I guess, you know, before we get right into the meat of all of the MIB material, I guess I'd just like to touch on the idea that, you know, is it true that there is a history of people who get involved in MIB research then being, you know, sought after by the MIB? Is you know, is there a truth to that?
Yeah, that actually is true. That, I mean, people, again, the misconception is that the MIB silence UFO witnesses, abductees, contactees, people who've had encounters. And very often that is the case. But it's also the case that the people who investigate them, you know, the sort of same thing has happened to them. I mean, this actually goes back to the early 1950s and a guy named Albert Bender. Albert Bender lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut at the time, and he was about 29, 30 years old. This was sort of 1952, 53. And he set up a UFO research group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. Now, a lot of groups were sort of set up in that period because it was the early years of ufology and people wanted to know what was going on. Bender's group, unlike a lot of them, you know, little sort of chapters around the world, he's really sort of took off massively, and it developed interest in Australia, Canada, Britain, all over the place. And he found himself sort of literally answering mail, you know, after work, just typing out letters or writing letters, sort of the early hours of the morning. And Bender was an unusual character. He was sort of very deeply into UFOs, but also heavily into the occult, not just in sort of fiction. He was heavily into things like H.P. Lovecraft, but also he was deeply involved with paranormal activity in the real world, studying it and doing all sorts of experiments and things like this. And on top of that, he lived in the attic of a creepy old house that kind of looked like the place where Norman Bates and his mom lived, or his dead mom, I should say. And so, you know, he was somebody who was sort of primed to get into, I guess, weird activity. Now, Bender, as I said, his group reached sort of massive levels. And what made it all the more strange was that the group had only been around a few months when he suddenly, out of the blue, shut it down. And there were these rumors flying around that Bender had been silenced by these three guys from the government, supposedly one from the Air Force, one from the FBI, and one from the CIA, all reportedly involved in some sort of clandestine project that Bender had inadvertently got too close to, and they warned him to remain silent. And at the time, Bender didn't disagree with that. He didn't agree with it or confirm it, but he didn't disagree with it. He just left the scene. This was like 53. Now, he actually did return very briefly in 1962 to write a book called Flying Saucers and the Three Men, which told the story of what he claimed really happened. And when you read Bender's book, his Men in Black sound like most of the reports that the majority of people talk about, rather than, you know, the Hollywood imagery. And he described these MIB as not sort of knocking on the front door and demanding to come in and showing ID cards, but he said he would be in his attic room late at night. He would start to feel dizzy and faint, and, you know, he'd have like a sense of vertigo. He'd have to sit down or lay down on the bed, and the room would be overwhelmed by this odor of like brimstone, you know, which is like like a demonic paranormal aspect in many reports. And he said these MIB would appear, but they weren't sort of physical beings. They were almost like a shadowy outline of a figure in like a black suit and a black old type fedora 1950s hat, and they'd be sort of blazing, glowing eyes and sort of pale skin, you know, like the color of somebody who got anemia. They kind of looked anorexic and gaunt and just ill, almost like death warmed up, you know, kind of like a zombie in a well-dressed zombie, if you like, the best way to describe him. And Bender found that he began to have all sorts of bad luck, health-wise and just in his general life, a lot of psychological and physical health. And that's why he said he walked away from it, that he felt they actually weren't government people. There was something weirder, and that it all involved the paranormal, the occult, and things that went far beyond just nuts and bolts ufology. So he was really the first and one of the most sort of graphic examples of how the MIB kind of get their grips into the researchers as well.
So Nick, there's actually a very scary notion that it's very prevalent in the MIB cases that I wanted to ask you about personally because, of course, you've done a lot of research on the Men in Black phenomenon. So, I mean, in all of your studies, and I mean, you've spoken about this on countless radio shows, and even been on TV, and of course, you have a book, The Real Men in Black. Have you ever noticed the Men in Black noticing you? Like, have you ever had any experience or run-ins with the Men in Black yourself?
Well, the closest I've come to it, there's actually two things. One, and this is something I've got on at least 5 or 6 occasions out of, say, every 10 or 11 shows I do. So we're talking about 50% of the shows I do on radio. I get very weird interference and problems with the shows, whether they're live or recorded. I mean, this has happened on things like Whitley Strieber's show, Coast to Coast, where they phoned me, the phone's gone dead, they've called on my cell, then that stopped working, and then in the end, but in one case, we had to give up for like 20 minutes. Now, if everybody gets this occasionally, but what's interesting, I do a lot of radio, and I can honestly say the only times it happens is when I'm discussing the Men in Black, and which is very weird. Now, I've never sort of had that knock on the front door or anything like that, or a weird phone call where I've been told, stay put out, keep away from this sort of stuff or else. That's never happened. But the telephone interference and weird noises on the line, that's happened time and time again. And I can only sort of conclude that it's kind of done as almost like an attempt to sort of make the person feel intimidated or frightened. But, that's not really my character. If that happens, I tell everybody about it. It just pushes me on, pushes me on further. So that's the closest I've come. But there have been cases where I've sort of planned to interview significant witnesses who've got important stories to tell. And, maybe a week's gone by from the initial contact to the point where I'm able to phone them or whatever, if I'm out of town or something. And in that intervening week, they've had like a weird, vaguely threatening phone call along the lines of, well, it perhaps wouldn't be a good idea to talk about this. And it's actually, in some cases, put them off speaking not because there was like a direct threat, but almost like a more subversive indirect threat where they didn't really know what it meant, but it could mean something, or in a worse case, you're dead, so to speak. So that's happened, which makes me think that there is some sort of surveillance. Now, in some of those cases, at least, I think that we could be looking at evidence of government agencies watching people, but equally, some of the people like Albert Bender and Brad Steiger and Gray Barker and John Keel, who were looking at the more paranormal aspects, they got a lot of this weird telephone stuff as well. So, maybe there's a crossover somewhere. And I actually think that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to understand what's going on, because there doesn't seem to be just this one category of MIB. There are these weirder, sort of ghoulish zombie types. And then there are the government people who back in the 50s, all the guys dressed like that back in the 50s, black suits and fedora hats. So you have the government people, because that was their regular kind of uniform. And on top of that, there are some cases, I think, where government agents have actually, I guess, sort of copied the weirder MIB to cover their tracks, if you like. They've used the mythology of the weirder MIB as camouflage so people won't find out who they are. So you've got possibly 3 categories of MIB going on, all sort of thrown into this weird mix.
I want to ask you about the possibility of, if somebody's out searching for this on the internet, what's the likelihood that they're going to be, I guess, picked up on the MIB's radar? I personally had an interesting little event, I guess, occur while I was researching for this show. I had made a YouTube playlist with a couple of your interviews on there, and I had gone on, listened to a couple of moments of them, put it into a playlist to listen later, only to come back the next day and have the videos were removed, the accounts were shut down, and I found that really strange. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what is the threshold that someone has to reach in order to get contact by one of these MIB?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, because everybody thinks that it's always sort of like a significant UFO event, but it actually isn't. Sometimes people have been visited by the MIB after they've just seen like a weird light in the sky, very high level, and they may have reported it to a local UFO group, or somebody, or the newspaper picked up on it. But there was no landing, there were no creatures seen, there was no abduction. It was just a light going slowly in the sky, and even people like that have been visited. So it's very difficult to know what kind of prompts the visitations. But in terms of what you just said, what is interesting is that there is sort of a body of material that shows that the MIB do seem to have a sort of an uncanny knack of knowing when people are looking for them. It's kind of like something goes off, like a radar or something like that, which allows them to realize that, hey, while we're doing this, somebody's trying to find out about us. And that, I guess, more than anything else, is kind of typified by cases where somebody sees a UFO and they're sort of worried about their reputations, and they tell no one, but still they get visited by the MIB. It's not like they've told the local press and the local newspapers put, Mr. Jones of High Street, whatever, saw a UFO, where anybody could look him up. They haven't told anyone, but they get visitations. So that's where it gets really creepy. It's like when you go looking for them, it's like something sparks off something that allows them to know, and then they get their grips into you.
So, Nick, do you think that can happen with something like really small? Like, I mean, just somebody who, just by talking on the phone, like maybe there's a program listening in, or somebody goes on the internet and they're just searching the MIB. I mean, do you think that just by doing something so little as that you could be being watched?
Well, yeah, you could. And the reason why, I always say, when it comes to like the UFO scene as such, or any paranormal scene, nobody's bigger than the subject itself. It doesn't matter if you're an author or a journalist or researcher. We're all pursuing the same things, and it's all a mystery to us. It doesn't matter if you sell 5,000 books or you just do a blog. I always view that we're all on the same level, but looking for answers. And because of that, what this may well mean is that anyone at any time could stumble upon the truth. You don't have to have written a dozen books to find the truth. Somebody else new to the scene, who's like 17 years old, could stumble upon the answer that we've all been looking for. So I think, there isn't a pattern, in other words, that allows us to understand when somebody might be watched by the MIB. The person who stumbles upon something significant may not realize the significance of what it is they've found and why they're being watched. They just think it's strange. Well, I'm new to the subject. Why are they watching me? Not realizing that, they may have inadvertently uncovered something that potentially pushes, a door open to at least some of the answers without them realizing it.
You mentioned something earlier interesting about Albert Bender, about his interest in the paranormal and magic and rituals in general. And, I found it interesting in my research that black magic rituals from the past, and including entries in the Bible, speak about a being that they refer to only as the Black Man. And in fact, there are some references to the devil as being called the Black Man. Do you believe there's any link there?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my views as far as UFOs are concerned, I guess, are quite controversial, and they kind of go against the grain for the idea that UFOs are just nuts and bolts spacecraft. But and people say, oh, Nick's off on his paranormal tangents or whatever, But I mean, I don't care. I don't care what people think. If I did, I'd have left this scene years ago. You've got to have sort of thick skin to be in ufology. But I've always been of the opinion that we have to look at all the data. And a lot of the data goes far beyond just the notion that we're dealing with extraterrestrials. I'm more inclined to think we're dealing with something that's sort of, I guess, extra or ultra-dimensional than literally coming from one star system to another. And I think some of I know that there are clear parallels between some phenomena, like occult phenomena, paranormal stuff, where there are clear crossovers between that and the UFO subject. And, when you talk about the devil, etc., I don't personally sort of adhere to the idea of a literal devil with a pitchfork and things like that, but I do think there could well be extra dimensions where there are sort of hostile entities that exist and they cross over into our world. And possibly, I'm quite interested to see this theory that they kind of survive by feeding on negative energy. They're almost like energy vampires, and maybe that's why people like Bender had so much stress and anxiety in their lives, that they provoke it and then they bleed it, if you like. They feed on it.
So would you perhaps ascribe them the title? I guess I've seen the term crypto-terrestrial.
That's not a bad term. It was, I think it was coined by Matt Tonis, who wrote a book called that, The Crypto-Terrestrials. I think a lot of people get into the subject, as I did, as a kid, and it's all black and white. It's aliens, nuts and bolts, etc. But you do find these sort of very clear crossovers, but also quite disturbing crossovers as well, where people have been visited by the MIB who've used Ouija boards. In my Real Men in Black book, I've got a chapter on cases like that where people have used a Ouija board and then the Men in Black have turned up. Then there's been violent poltergeist activity in the house. Now, when you talk about things like demons and devils and things like that, well, one of the things about the MIB that you'd imagine, if they're going to come to your front door and silence you, if you open the door at 10 o'clock at night, they're going to kick, or if you don't open it, I should say, they're going to kick it down and force you against the wall or whatever. That actually doesn't happen. What they do, they generally do turn up at night and they bang on the front door. The person opens the front door and they just stand there waiting to come in, or they'll make sort of an enigmatic phrase about, you had a strange experience, we'd like to talk to you about it. But they never enter the house until they're invited, which is kind of goes along with the ancient folklore about vampires that, on the first occasion they can't enter your home until you invite them in. Now, this makes me wonder if a lot of old vampire stories could actually be based upon distorted reports of MIB running around the countryside hundreds of years ago. Maybe it's actually not a new phenomenon, but a very old one.
So, Nick, one of the interesting things that, occurred to me, one of the things that really came into my mind, like we did a podcast with David Weatherly a couple months ago on the Black-Eyed Children. Mm-hmm. And one of the similarities that I see between the Men in Black in some cases and the Black-Eyed Children are that they have really strange mannerisms. Like this one story I read was... the story of Dr. Herbert Hopkins, and apparently his daughter-in-law had gotten a phone call one day, to meet. This guy called. He apparently knew her husband John, and so they were going to meet up, kind of a thing. And like when he came over, he had all kinds of strange questions, and he was also with a female. So there's a couple of cases where they talk about the female kind of version of the Men in Black, and they said that her legs had, they weren't connected properly to her hip joints or something like that. So, is there any connection that you've seen between the Men in Black and like the weird phrases and mannerisms in comparison to the Black-Eyed Children?
Yeah, there's actually a lot. They don't sort of seem very fully aware of our customs and mannerisms. Some people might sort of see them as sort of blunt, to the point of, sort of being ignorant or whatever. But it genuinely seems to come down to that they're not from around here. They don't seem to understand how to interact with us. It's almost like when they appear, it's almost like they're a program. They're sort of like a sophisticated computer program. The best way I can describe it is they're kind of like the Men in Black in the Matrix movies, in the sense there's something that's inserted into the program to achieve a particular aim and goal, but it's still a sophisticated program. And if you kind of, I guess, crash that program by not responding in the way that's expected, where you fall for the threat, if you like, and stay silent, they don't know what to do and they hurriedly leave. And so I think maybe if they are somebody's sort of sophisticated program in like a 3D form, then that might explain why in all the occasions that they're seen, they follow this very weird process of asking certain questions, remaining very enigmatic, not really sort of sure of their surroundings or even what they are possibly. Maybe they're not even fully self-aware themselves. They're just vaguely aware of what they're supposed to do. So I think, the very fact that all around the world we find reports where it's not just the fact that the person's been visited, but it's the fact that they've been visited by people who just don't act like people. They just don't act in ways that they should act. And that's, that does tie in with some of these stories about the black-eyed children where they just say, they stand on the doorstep demanding to be let in, or can they use the phone? Most people would realize that, well, you're not going to let people in your house just use the phone when you don't know them, particularly at 10 o'clock at night, but they don't even seem to understand or appreciate that, or they don't care. So there's a lot of weirdness like that where the characters are totally different to ours.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed actually, and it's kind of strange, is that, you read some cases with the Men in Black where they seem, intelligent, like really intelligent, that they're very dominant in the situation. But I've also came across stories where, like they again, with the thinly veiled threats, and the people that they threaten are just, they're not scared, and they're like, no, I'm not gonna obey. And it's like it's like they short circuit. They don't know how to handle. They can't compute, that situation. I mean, do you think there's a difference between, these kinds of cases that maybe some could be clones, or that there's a difference between these encounters?
Well, I don't think it's so much a difference between the encounters in terms of what the beings are. I think the response of the MIB is dictated by the response of the people. It's like you said that in most cases, if a bunch of guys sort of turn up on your doorstep at 10 o'clock and want to come in, and you are foolish enough to let them in, and they intimidate you and threaten you, and they've got skin pale as milk, and they look, as I said, just like well-dressed zombies, that probably would frighten and silence most people, and it's like the program then runs smoothly. But if you stand up against them, it literally is like you've inserted something into the program that rewires it, and they're not prepared for that rewiring. That's what leads me to believe that whatever they are, I'm actually not against the idea that maybe in some cases, these MIB experiences occur in like an altered state where the witness is placed into almost like a hallucinatory state, and they actually think it's experiencing or taking place in like a 3D real life time. But what if, it's sort of like a semi-sleep state, but a sophisticated hologram where, again, like a literal program is inserted into the person's mind, and, and they perceive and see the MIB. But if they stand up to it, the program crashes. Maybe there's something to that. But whatever these things are, they seem to follow a pattern, a set train, a set program, and they can be derailed from it if the person doesn't go along with what they generally expect them to go along with.
So following the chronology, I guess, of what appears to be the appearance of Men in Black in the distant past, and biblical stories with interactions with alchemists and magicians during the Middle Ages, I guess bringing it up to a more current time, the event the phenomenon seemed to evolve, and I guess the first event being the Maury Island incident with Harold Dahl. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, this is a sort of weird and controversial story where in June 1947, actually a couple of days before the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting that prompted the creation of the term flying saucer, An event occurred at a place called Tacoma in Washington State, a place called Maury Island. And it reportedly involved like a fleet of flying saucers that were flying over the harbor. One of them reportedly malfunctioned and exploded and rained all this material, this debris and wreckage over the harbor. Reportedly killed Harold Dahl's dog, which was on a boat at the time with him, injured crew members and damaged the boat quite severely. And reportedly, some of this material, this sort of wreckage, this debris, was collected, and in a roundabout way, the Air Force got to hear about it. And of course, this was the early weeks of the beginnings of the UFO wave of 1947, and so the Air Force traveled out there to pick up some of this material, to have it analyzed and try and determine what it was. What was kind of disturbing was that the two airmen that picked it up and were going to take it back to the Air Force's Foreign Technology Division for analysis, on the way back during the flight, their aircraft exploded and they were killed, and this material evidence, whatever it was never recovered or found. And on top of that, one of the people who was a major player in this story and who handled some of the wreckage and was responsible for shuttling it from Harold Dahl to the Air Force was a man named Fred Chrisman. And in the late 1960s, Fred Chrisman was identified as playing a sort of a significant role in none other than the Kennedy assassination. And this involved Jim Garrison, who was played by Kevin Costner in the JFK movie, actually coming to conclude that Chrisman was heavily involved in some capacity, possibly even as one of the so-called second gunmen, if you like. So you have this man involved in this sort of shady UFO incident that involved the deaths of two airmen, right through to the Kennedy assassination. But what was interesting is that at the height of the Maury Island affair, Harold Dahl initially was quite willing to speak about what occurred, but he claimed to have been silenced by this character in a black suit who warned him not to talk about it all if he knew what was good for him. And even Kenneth Arnold was sponsored to go and do an investigation of it. And to Arnold's sort of concern and his anger as well, he found evidence that his hotel room in town had been bugged, and people were listening in on conversations and repeating them back to him. So again, it was like a very early example of an MIB type case, but it doesn't have the sort of the weirder, creepy aspects. So I'm sort of straddled two areas in this. I'm not sure if this is like the weirder MIB or this may just have been, sort of a government operation where they crossed the line and threatened someone, but they were from the government rather from somewhere else, perhaps.
If there is a link between the idea of the dark man or of past supernatural like beings being connected to the MIB, what do you think is the significance with the change in their apparent MO, I guess you would say, where they've now become focused, it seems, on the UFO phenomenon?
Well, we tend to think they're focused on the UFO phenomenon, but as I said, people like Bender, Bender was heavily involved in the paranormal as well. So it's like a 50-50 thing, was he visited because of the UFO angle, or was he visited because he was making a connection between UFOs and the paranormal and, unlocking doors that way that people didn't want unlocking. Kind of like with the Ouija boards, where people have been visited by the MIB after that. Some of them were involved in UFOs, but others of them weren't. They literally just got the same visits. So the more I've looked into it, I've even found people who've been visited by the MIB after investigating things like Bigfoot. So I've come more around to the idea in the last few years, certainly, that perhaps these, in simple terms, they're not just watching people in the UFO field. They're almost like paranormal police. They police the paranormal, but so much emphasis has been placed on their involvement with ufology that some of these other fringe areas, people haven't realized that they also play a role in that. I mean, in my Real Men in Black book, I talk about a case at Loch Ness in Scotland where a well-known Loch Ness researcher in the 70s, a man named Ted Holliday, he was someone who came to believe that the Loch Ness Monster had sort of demonic or occult origins. And when he was at the lock in 1974, he actually had an encounter with a man in black on the shores of the lock, and it sort of, chilled him to the bone. And the following year, in pretty much the same location, he had a near-fatal heart attack, which prompted him to sort of really scale back what he was doing, because he felt he was dabbling in things that, were sort of far beyond what he'd expected. He was just trying to bag an unknown animal, and then before he knew it, he was having all these weird things that led him to believe it was paranormal, and then the MIB turn up. So I think, they could be sort of policing whole swathes of, the sort of supernatural investigations and investigators as well.
So if we could just reference Albert Bender's story again, do you remember, when he had his meeting with the 3 MIBs that materialized in his room, they had given him a piece of metal, a strange piece of metal, and when he'd squeezed this piece of metal in the palm of his hand, and he'd focused on this word Kazakh, and he'd claimed that that's when the MIB, it was like summoning them, and all of, because you've gone through at least 400 or 500 different MIB reports, and any of those other reports, was the word Kazakh ever mentioned?
Well, I've not heard the word Kazakh before, but I mean, I should say other than Bender's case. But what I would say is that, this whole angle of using a word to open a door or summon something, or, then they appear. I mean, that's really, come back to Ouija boards, that's no different from sort of putting a message out there with a Ouija board, or meditating on something and trying to, open a portal or whatever, and then something comes through. A lot of it comes down to sort of using a ritual to unlock a metaphorical doorway to another realm. And maybe sometimes people know how to do it. Sometimes they do it by accident. Sometimes they do it deliberately, but they're not really sure how they did it. But I think what this all comes down to is sort of the nature of things like ancient rituals and perceived magical words that can, I guess, open us up to other realms that we don't normally see, and open us up also to whatever inhabits those other realms too. And maybe that includes the Men in Black.
That's actually really interesting. I hadn't thought of it. Now, Albert Bender had written, he had come out after he had been supposedly silenced, and in a friend's book, he had told his, his entire exotic tale. And of course, he where he would travel outer body to this other dimension with the MIB. Now, some people claim that he had purposely given the spectacular story to throw off the real scientists and stuff like that. I mean, do you think that he did that to throw people off his trail, or that it was genuine?
Well, I tend to think it was genuine. I'm not sure that Bender had experiences that were all totally in the 3D world. I come back to this idea as to whether or not there could be almost like a created dream, almost like come back to the Matrix, where somebody's in a dream world not realizing it, and that maybe that's how some of these MIB experiences occur. But the main reason why I don't think Bender sort of made it up to get rid of people and, to sort of get them off his back or whatever, was because so many other people before and since also have described these sort of glowing-eyed, creepier, shadowy Men in Black that Bender claimed to have seen. If it was just him and everybody else was talking about people that seemed to come from the government, then there would be a good argument for saying Bender had made it up, because no one else was saying that. But, ironically, even though Bender gets a bad rap because there are a lot of weird and sensational aspects to the story, his MIB are very much similar to the ones that were seen in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, when the Mothman was reported in that area by John Keel. A lot of those stories investigated by Brad Steiger, they were these sort of creepy, anorexic-looking MIB as well. So, Bender's story was just one of many, but I think, as I said, it was the attendant, really controversial stuff about him being taken to some underground place in a polar region and learning that the aliens were supposedly extracting or mining some rare elements or something like that from the planet. And, and as I said, he was a weird character as well. There's good evidence he had obsessive compulsive disorder, and he was a hypochondriac, and he lived in this attic which he wanted to convert into like a chamber of horrors, and so he was into a lot of weird stuff. But that doesn't mean that, I mean, when people are into weird stuff, sometimes they go down pathways and they do open doors. I'm not making light of it. He was just somebody who was, I think, primed to get into all this.
So when we talk about, words of power and incantations and rituals, one thing that I came across several times that I was extremely surprised about was this reference to a strange insignia that was sometimes seen on the uniforms of the Men in Black. And on further, research on that specific topic, it seemed, I guess, witnesses appear to be describing the Eye of Horus, however it's pronounced. Or the Eye of Ra, I guess some people call it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, this sort of, again, impacts on my belief that the phenomenon, the Men in Black phenomenon, isn't a new one. It's a very, very old one. And, it goes back into the sort of the early years of history. I mean, the Men in Black have sort of an uncanny knack of turning up at critical points and just out of nowhere, out of the blue, and then they vanish. And, you could even go back to biblical times and find stories, for example, when Sodom and Gomorrah were supposedly going to be destroyed by God, which actually sounds more like an atomic destruction if you read it retrospectively. You suddenly have these mysterious visitors turning up, warning Lot, I think it was, and his wife, to leave the area quickly. You could even get to in controversial areas, but, when Jesus was supposedly born, who turned up? 3 wise men. I mean, is there a tie-in there? Another interesting angle you briefly mentioned earlier, alchemy. There are a number of stories about alchemists in the sort of Middle Ages, sort of 1600s, dabbling with sort of archaic magical rituals to try and turn base metals into precious metals like gold, and reportedly getting late-night visits from black-cloaked individuals warning them to stay away from, delving into alchemy. There's not that much difference between delving into an esoteric substance, a subject like alchemy in the 1500s and getting a visit from a black-cloaked character or demon than delving into something like UFOs in the 21st century and getting a visit from a black-suited MIB. It's the motif might have changed, but there aren't that many differences. So when you talk about all this with the Eye of Horus and things like that, I think it shows what we're seeing is the modern incarnation of something that may have been around as long as us, but which sort of manifests in different ways according to the beliefs or folklore or the people of that period. Maybe it manifests and appears in a way that mirrors our subconscious beliefs as to how it should appear. Perhaps we're partly responsible for how it actually manifests physically, if you like.
Now, this might be referencing the same thing in a slightly different way, but according to John Keel, the Men in Black represent an organization called the Nation of the Third Eye. Now, the first thing that came to my mind then was that the third eye, of course, being the pineal gland, which is always associated, with meditation and ascension and things of this nature. I mean, do you know anything about that particular society or the Men in Black connection?
Well, I don't know any more than Keel wrote. I have to be honest, I haven't researched that at all. But I mean, this whole angle, the third eye and, the idea that we can see things potentially that we don't normally see, if we take the time, if we meditate, we apply ancient rituals, that kind of thing. I do firmly believe that. I do believe there are genuinely realms around us that we don't normally have any notice of, but that we can sort of cross paths with, and, they can interact with us. And I think a lot of these entities in these other realms are sort of very skilled at zipping in and out of our reality. And that's why so many of these things, particularly like the MIB, have this sort of here 1 minute, gone the next minute aspect to them, where people, when the MIB leave, it's like the person suddenly comes out of a haze and they race to the front door, but they've already gone, when they should only be sort of 15 feet down the driveway or whatever. So I think there is a lot to the idea that meditation, things like this can open doorways that allow us access or to peer through, or maybe like when the MIB seem to know when we're looking for them. It's kind of like if you go looking for these doorways and you open them, whatever's on the other side knows, and then it gets its grips into you. It's kind of like when you talk about the pineal gland and things like, for example, DMT, which is a naturally occurring substance in the body, but people who have been involved in DMT experiments, in large quantities, they've experienced what seems to be, some people say it's hallucinations, but, there's an eerily weird parallel in many of these cases where somebody having a DMT trip actually seems to enter a different realm, not physically, but it's like a door opens, so a literal door of perception opens, and a person gets a glimpse into these other realms. But we can't sort of do it to order. But maybe these things, these creatures, whatever they are, can do it.
We talk about alchemy and UFOs in the modern century. Is there a connection, I guess, outside of the esoteric in terms of just technology? Do we have any examples of advanced technology seemingly attracting the MIB to it?
Well, actually, there are some cases, and this isn't something I've really written about that much, but sometimes you can find some stories that do seem somewhat MIB-like, where fringe scientists claim to have been visited by strange visitors and things like that, who were help them to sort of fill in the blanks in some of the work they were doing. People like Nikola Tesla actually thought he was being contacted by extraterrestrials at one point. There are a number of people like him who also felt they were receiving sort of contacts or information when they were delving into some very alternative fringe science areas. And some of these people, did come across like mysterious MIB. They were sort of well-dressed individuals who seemed have to have an air of power about them, a kind of like an old school money type situation, from old powerful families, that kind of how people describe them. And they would help them with a few answers to the questions they were looking for, and then they were gone. So in some cases it's difficult to understand what's going on because you have like the alchemists being silenced, but other fringe scientists actually getting help. So clearly I think we're not understanding what the big picture is. We're missing part of the story somewhere.
Yeah, one of the things that actually has driven a wedge between my brain on what to think of the MIB is that on one hand you have these cases where they show up and like in the alchemist example, they're trying to help, even if by warning. Whereas in other cases, the people who have had these run-ins with the MIB report, that it was a very malicious, sense of evil about them. And, again, these thinly veiled threats. And so, are these guys good guys or bad guys? At the same time, they got this, they've been described as having a smell of like brimstone. In the case of Albert, Albert Bender's story. And of course, that's associated with like demonic entities, it's like a burning sulfur. So are these evil entities, or is it, are they tied to UFOs? Are they tied to the paranormal? Or are they simply just a different race or species of a different dimensional being that can cross over?
Well, that's actually a good question because, our initial perception is if we're silenced and threatened and these people sort of look weird and whatever, then it's got to be evil and it's got to be, a case that they're the bad guys. But one of the people I interviewed for my book was Josh Warren. Josh is a good friend of mine who lives in Asheville, North Carolina. And he's come up with sort of a very controversial theory, but an interesting one. And granted, it is theoretical. What if the MIB are actually time travelers from the future? And, would that explain or could explain a couple of things? Number one, sort of the out-of-date clothing they always seem to wear. Everything about the clothing's out of time. They drive sort of 1950s style black cars, straight out of old-time gangster movies, that kind of thing. and they don't seem fully conversant with our mannerisms. And Josh wondered, maybe the MIB are sort of like time police, that possibly he viewed the UFO phenomenon from the perspective of, what if they're not aliens or interdimensional entities? What if they're us from the future, sort of camouflaging themselves as aliens to protect, the secret of who they really are, sort of us, millions of years or thousands of years from now. And Josh wondered if the MIB are actually, they pop up when somebody gets close to doing something which could tamper with the timelines and cause disasters to occur, in the workings of the timeline. So he kind of wondered if they could be like, sort of hidden heroes almost, preventing disasters from occurring. And if they have to silence a few people and threaten them to make sure the rest of us are okay, they'll do that. So maybe the idea that they're sort of the villains of the piece may not be the case. Certainly for the person who gets the threat, they are. But, it's from that whole angle of the greater good. If we're dabbling into things that really we shouldn't be, maybe their whole modus operandi is, let's shut it down no matter what, because there's a more important, bigger picture, in which case they would be sort of not the villains. They might be the good guys, but we just don't perceive them that way because of how they come across.
That's interesting.
I know we mentioned at some point earlier here about the connection between possible underground races. I guess what comes into mind is the king of the earth, king of the world myth. What are your feelings on that? Or thoughts, I guess?
Well, yeah, I mean, there has been this sort of theory that the MIB is kind of tied to, I guess, that these ancient, I won't say civilizations, but ancient powerful groups that, allegedly run the world. The idea is that governments and presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, etc., they're just the figureheads. And there are these sort of far more powerful, almost like magically powerful individuals and secret societies that, manipulate things, and that they're the ones who are really in charge of things. And again, one of the theories is, the idea that the MIB are kind of tied to them, and they're dispatched and sent out, when somebody's starting to put the pieces together of what's really going on in the world, the bigger picture that we don't normally see. And of course, there are a lot of stories about sort of underground entities which go back, to the dawning of civilization, throughout pretty much every culture, if not every culture on the planet. You can find stories of magical beings and entities that would live underground and that would often surface late at night, and they would kidnap babies and break into people's homes, and they sort of sound eerily similar to today's alien abduction accounts, with hybrid babies and things like that. But 500 years ago, they were talking about these encounters with goblins. 2,000, 3,000 years ago in sort of ancient Babylonia, it was demons breaking into people's homes. But, they all had this tie with either underground realms or coexisting places. And, so I think there could be something to the idea that, maybe there are underground realms where some of these creatures or whatever live. I mean, Mac Tonis, in his book, The Crypto-Terrestrials, he sort of put forward the theory that what if the UFO phenomenon isn't extraterrestrial or even interdimensional? What if, the so-called aliens are actually an ancient offshoot of the human race that surfaced and flourished long before us, and that perhaps are now on an evolutionary decline, and they use us in legitimate abductions, but they pass themselves off as extraterrestrials to prevent us finding out from what they really are. And maybe, the fact that some of these MIB look human but look odd could be explained by the fact that they're sort of an ancient offshoot of us, but they're still related to us rather than being something definitively alien, if you like.
So, Nick, one of the things that I wanted to discuss, actually, is that, of course, we know that the MIB have these threats. I mean, that's just part of their encounters. Now, a couple of stories that I've run across is like this astrophysicist, Morris K. Jessup. You know, he was investigating the UFOs and the secret Navy experiments and disappearing ships and invisible men. And then he gets found in an alleged suicide. And then there was Frank Edwards, who was a radio host that, you know, he talked about UFOs a lot. And first they fire him. And, you know, the reason allegedly was because, you know, the content was irritating to the Defense Department, and they put pressure on his radio station, AFL, to fire him. So Frank starts up another syndicated radio station, and he gets visited by 3 men in black. He doesn't listen, and then he shows up dead. So was there any cases that you found that were detailed in any way that, you know, in the within regards to, you know, the men in black had effectively taken someone out, like killed them, or someone who died under suspicious circumstances?
Well, I mean, for the most part, I mean, I actually haven't sort of found any cases where I can definitively say the men in black have killed someone. There are certainly cases, many cases, where they've made sort of veiled threats that, you know, accidents can happen and it might not be a good idea to drive down this road late at night, that kind of thing, where it creates like a scenario where the person thinks, hang on, you know, did they just threaten my life? But they don't actually come right out and say that to the person. They allow the person to join the dots together, so to speak. And actually doing that in some respects makes the person more fearful because they're not really sure what's going on. So they're looking over their shoulder all the time, which may be the overriding goal is not just to silence the person, but to ensure they're so frightened that, you know, the fear stays with them forever. Now, I think arguably that would make more sense because if you actually did kill people on a regular basis, we would clearly see a pattern developing where you would have like the police involved and, you know, law enforcement, etc. But because there's actually technically no crime committed because the person, by their own admission, has let the MIB in, even if they're not sure afterwards why. It's almost like they were, you know, mind controlled. No crime has been committed. You know, the MIB were invited in, they sat down, the person answered their questions, and then they got up and left. So there's not much the police could do unless an actual murder was committed. So maybe that's why that doesn't happen that much if the threat works. Now, yes, there are some cases where, like, for example, Morris Jessup, I think that's a classic example of one that can be considered very mysterious and highly controversial. But, other cases, you don't get that. I mean, like Brad Steiger was heavily investigating the MIB in the 60s, as was John Keel. You know, Brad's still thriving and on the scene, and he's like 75 and still cranking books out. Keel lived to his 70s, you know. You can go on. And so there doesn't seem to be that process where the MIB have a definitive pattern, you know, but that doesn't mean that there haven't been, you know, controversial deaths and mysterious deaths in the UFO field. There have been, you know, and I think it would be, you know, be a good idea if somebody actually wrote a book that sort of tried to nail all those cases to the wall, you know, definitively once and for all, so to speak.
Well, moving along the lines of, the MO of the MIB, I guess, the way they behave. Most of us, our image of them are a group of people who are trying to dissuade somebody from talking about or researching a certain topic. But, you know, there are some pretty famous examples of that that really backfiring. And I guess one of the ones that jumped out to me would be the story of Herbert Hopkins. Would you be able to detail some of that for our listeners who may not have heard the story before?
Yeah, this is probably one of the spookiest cases on record. Herbert Hopkins was somebody who was a doctor who was interested in UFOs, and he was investigating sort of a number of contact/abduction stories in the 1970s. And like a lot of people, you know, he's delving into very, very deeply and specific, important cases. And one Saturday night, his wife and family had gone out to the local cinema and he didn't want to go. And he got this strange phone call from somebody claimed to be from a local UFO group, and could they come over and chat with him? And, you know, of all nights, this was when he was alone at the house. And so he said, well, yeah, sure. He thought it was a bit strange, but, you know, he was pretty much okay with it. So what he did, he just waited and expected sort of 30 minutes, 45 minutes, the person be over. They were there in like a flash, as if they were stood at the bottom of the drive using a cell phone. But this was 1976, there weren't any cell phones back then. And the guy was just on the doorstep, and he described him as sort of one of the strangest looking people he'd seen. He was like completely hairless, not... I shave my head every day, but, after a couple of hours, you can see stubble coming through, you know what I mean? Mine's sort of shaved to the bone, but, you can still see the hair there. This guy was like an egg, they were just, his skin was described as being very weird, imagine like a grown man, but with skin, the look and texture of like a baby, that would look very creepy, and that's how he was described. Had these strange, penetrating, starey eyes, kind of like, the eyes that a dog has when it's about to bite you or whatever. And Hopkins was kind of, frightened and didn't really know what to say or do. But like a lot of people who experience the MIB, he invited the guy in. It's almost as if they take control of your common sense factors, in the sense that, if that guy was at your front door at 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, would you let him in? You probably wouldn't. And you wouldn't sit down and just be willing to answer all these battery of questions or interrogations. But people do. It's like they just don't know why they're doing it, but nevertheless they are. And so, in that sense, Herbert Hopkins' story fits in right with so many others. Now, again, he got a threat to basically leave the subject, and these specific cases he was looking at alone. And the way the MIB did this, he referred to the famous case of Betty and Barney Hill, who had an abduction experience in New Hampshire in 1961, sort of one of the early abduction stories. And this MIB that was speaking to Hopkins supposedly said something along the lines of, Barney Hill died at a young age. This could happen to you. That was basically the gist of it. And he did this sort of weird trick where he asked Hopkins to take a couple of coins. He said, you have 2 coins in your pocket, and seemed to know that without even being aware of it, and held them in his hand, and they just vanished in front of Hopkins. He was just totally astonished by it. And what's interesting is that there are a number of stories that I have on record where the MIB had done weird things with coins, or they were connected with coins, where they made coins vanish or appear. Or in one case, this actually goes back way before the case of Hopkins in the early 1950s, where somebody had seen these 3 MIB, and then after they left, the guy noticed something shining on the floor, and it looked like an old type Roman type coin where they were standing. And what's interesting is that, this ability of the MIB to supposedly dematerialize and materialize coins, in other words, doing magical things with metal, you have this sort of overtone with alchemy as well, performing magical rituals using various metals. So you have to wonder if the MIB in the past were silencing people getting too close to their skills and technologies. And maybe they demonstrated something to Hopkins for that reason. But he got very disturbed by all this and reportedly destroyed the tapes and left the whole thing behind him. And, he was never sort of really the same again in terms of his research, and kept a sort of wary eye on how far he went with it or didn't go with it.
If I have my facts correct here, I do believe that when after the coin disappeared, the Men in Black, or the Man in Black, I guess, was quoted as saying something to the effect that that coin is gone now. It's now on another plane. And then he made some reference to Barney Hill, and he said that Barney Hill didn't have the heart. And I guess I actually did go and look and see what Barney Hill died of, and apparently it was a brain aneurysm and nothing to do with his heart. But do you have any any opinions on what in the world that could have meant?
Well, again, I think it was one of these veiled threats. It wasn't a case of saying, if you keep up what you're doing, we're going to kill you. or you'll have an accident or you'll die in what looks like an accident. It was this veiled illusion where, he did say something like, Barney Hill had no heart, and you can end up with no heart or whatever. And it was kind of allowing Hopkins to fill in the gaps of, well, hang on, what's he saying? And I think that kind of works very well because people remember it. They remember the threat and how ominous it was. But again, it's very rarely that they follow through on it. And if people stand up to them, they back down. But the problem is most people don't stand up to them because it's not just a message. What instills so much fear is the appearance. It's kind of like, I guess at some point or another, we've all met someone who, even if you don't know them, you look at them or you sit next to them, and there's something that you just don't like about them, but you don't know why. They seem to exude this air of like menace, or there's just something about them that's unsettling. And that's what everybody reports in the MIB cases, that even though they kind of look vaguely normal in some respects, everything about them is abnormal. It's kind of just like being around someone who, for whatever reason, you don't want to be around, and you shouldn't be. And so that feeling often overwhelms the person to where they normally might stand up to somebody, they sort of crushes them into the ground, and they're just sort of paralyzed by fear or whatever.
So one of the things that actually reminded me of a story in Dr. Hopkins' encounter, of course, how the men in black were on the stairs impossibly quick, after he got off the phone with them. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen this documentary. It's actually Dan Aykroyd, Unplugged on UFOs.
No, I haven't seen that, no.
Okay, well, it was interesting to me. I actually seen it in a bargain bin one day, and I was a fan of. I've always been a fan of Dan Aykroyd, and I was just surprised to see him, so invested into something like UFOs. It's outside of Hollywood movies, kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. And he used to have this show called Out There.
Yeah.
And that was discussing all these paranormal things. And anyway, in this UFO documentary, he details an account where he was in between tapings or something like that, and he was outside on a cell phone, and he was talking. He was actually talking to Britney Spears about joining her for something on Saturday Night Live, and he sees this black sedan coming down this road, and he turned and he said something on the phone, and when he looked back, it was impossibly gone. Like there was nowhere to have it. There was nowhere to have. That it could have went in that amount of time. And, right after that this had happened, actually, I even think I remember, I could be wrong, but I thought I remembered him saying that there was a gentleman that got out and looked at him, a really cold look, like a Men in Black type of look. And anyway, right after that, his show was canceled, which, is pretty amazing. I mean, here you have someone... very well known in Hollywood, has this show, and right after this bizarre encounter, his show was gone, and of course the show was on the paranormal. So we had that misfortune that seems to follow some people. Can you think of any really not so well known examples of people who have been left with either an illness or misfortune or something, having an encounter with the Men in Black?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to go back to Albert Bender, he's a classic example. I mean, whenever he would have these experiences, he would have these sort of overpowering migraines, dizzy spells, lightheadedness, and he just began to get so many sort of bad aches and pains and different things that he began to fear that he got some sort of a cancer. That's how he felt. He just felt so ill all the time. And it was only when he sort of left the subject that it was as if, moving away from it sent whatever it was packing, so to speak. But there are other cases where, I talk about in the book, where people had just runs of bad luck, which created stress and anxiety, and even, broke up marriages and things like that, because the person became sort of so overwhelmed and obsessed that, everything revolved around it. And their psychological health was severely damaged as well. And, unfortunately, that does happen. That's why I always say to people, it's important to have a life away from this as well. Go and do normal stuff too.
Yes,
but
certainly.
This is normal, I don't know. But I mean, it's like me, I do all this, but then, at night I like to watch English football. I get down the pub with the mates or whatever. We have drink a few beers or whatever. So, I mean, joking aside, I found that the phenomenon of the Men in Black, for some reason, it often obsesses people to the point where negativity begins to develop, which is why I've always tried to maintain not a distance from it, but an objective space between doing research and then life away from it. But the MIB do seem to have an uncanny knack of dragging people in to where they become so obsessed that then they start to have all this strange stuff happen where they get sick and ill. It's like a negative backlash almost, where the phenomenon can actually sort of almost like hit you with illnesses and disease. It sounds controversial, but, there's so many reports like that.
Going back to Albert's headaches, one of the interesting details that I read was that, he would only get these it was like paralyzing like headaches. They were so bad, but he would get it whenever he thought of, going, like coming out with his story, like talking about it. Do you suppose that the Men in Black had done this with like an implant, or that they had maybe brainwashed him in a way that like, it was like implanted in his brain to
Yeah, I actually think it's probably more like, I don't think it was probably like a literal implant, but I mean, sort of like a subliminal hypnotic message or something along those lines, that would be more likely, and it would work very well. I mean, for example, take people who are frightened to leave the house, is it agoraphobia or claustrophobia, whichever one it is. They get to the front door and they open the front of the door, they can't breathe properly, they start to go dizzy. Well, that's, the fear of something that is and it prevents them from doing it, but it manifests in a very real physical fashion. But there's no actual reason. It's just the fear of going through that door into the big wide world outside. And I think with Bender, it could have been something similar, where he was unknowingly, I guess, sort of mentally implanted with some suggestion that, if you try and write about this or think about it, you're going to be hit by these pummeling headaches. It happens once, and then he notices a trend, and every time it crops up, the headaches are back. So it forces the person to walk away from it more and more to the point where they do leave it behind.
You mentioned something earlier while talking about the appearance of the Men in Black, and it's something that just popped into my mind. I don't know if you're familiar. Of course, the varied interests that we have. I'm interested in robotics amongst other things, and there's this hypothesis that was put forth by Professor Masahiro Mori called the Uncanny Valley, and it's the theory that in the robotics industry that we can come so close to mimicking human behavior and human movements and human-like robotics and prosthetics. However, there always seems to be a unidentifiable quality about the robot that especially in extremely human-like robots that tend to cause a repulsive reaction in people who meet the robot, even if it may be built to be an attractive woman. It creates this reaction in them, and I never equated the two before, but do you think there's any link between the Uncanny Valley theory and the Men in Black and the response that they give to people?
Yeah, I think that actually could be. I mean, I've actually read about this where people, or studies have been done, and it's psychologically shown that, if you see like a robot off something like some old 1950s movie, everybody thinks that's cool. And also a robot that can mimic human activity, like a robotic hand or something like that. Well, that's good, for people who've lost their arms or whatever. But yeah, when people see them and they look eerily human, it's almost like, well, what are they thinking? Are they going to take us over or something? And they have this odd almost like an ethereal look because there's no actual soul or substance there, and I think it gives them this cold kind of appearance. It's kind of like, unfortunately, when somebody passes away, and they say, do you want to view the body? Well, I mean, I've experienced this, when you see the person, it's kind of a shock, and it's a little bit unsettling because they look just like the person, but they look nothing like them as well. Do you know what I mean? I'm sure everybody who's ever been to one of those viewings will know what I mean. Even though it's difficult to explain, it's kind of like you look at them and it's the person, but everything about them is kind of shocking because equally it doesn't look like them in some way. It's almost like, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to people, going to a wake or a viewing, but it's like something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where the person has been replaced by something almost identical, but it's slightly off. And I think that's the same with the Men in Black, that people know there's something wrong about the way they look, but they're not fully able to put their finger on what it is. They just know there's something wrong about the appearance, or not necessarily the physical appearance, but the sort of weird look they have on the face. It's like one woman described the MIB as having a look like a dog when it's about to bite, down to its eyes and its stance and everything. She felt it was like very difficult for a human to mimic that, but this creature, or whatever you want to call it, seemed to have no trouble. So I think there is that aspect to it, that there's something about their appearance in their face that is almost like so enigmatically odd that subconsciously we know that, but even if we're not sure why.
So, Nick, one other story that was, pretty prominent with the Men in Black, of course, was the Mothman sightings. Can you tell us what the connection was between the Men in Black and the Mothman?
Yeah, well, this goes back to what I said about how, everybody thinks the MIB just turn up in UFO cases, but my other big interest, apart from UFOs, in terms of the paranormal, probably a bigger interest is cryptozoology, which is the study of unknown animals like Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra, and so on. I've written sort of 5 or 6 books on that subject. And but the Mothman story is interesting because it has crossover parallels between the UFO subject and cryptozoology. Now, again, let's go back to sort of Ted Holliday's story at Loch Ness, when he came to believe the Loch Ness Monster was more paranormal based. What's interesting is that Aleister Crowley, the famous occultist, actually owned a house at Loch Ness called Boleskine House, which was later owned by Jimmy Page, the guitarist with Led Zeppelin. And Crowley actually engaged in all sorts of rites and rituals to try and summon occult entities up from the loch. So you have a tie-in there. And we have this tie-in with a lot of these weird creatures where they seem to be more paranormal-based than just animals that science hasn't fully recognized or understood yet. And this ties in with the Mothman, which is described as this sort of glowing-eyed humanoid figure, but with these large bat-like wings. So in other words, it sounds like some sort of modern-day equivalent of an ancient gargoyle or a demon or something like that. Now, the sightings of the Mothman began not specifically in 1966, 1967, but it was around that period. Although there were 1 or 2 reports a few years earlier in the region. But people reported sort of 66, 67, seeing this creature that became known as the Mothman. And again, sort of very ominous, black, dark figure with these glowing eyes that was sort of looming in the shadows and menaced people. Very sort of gothic type story to it. But at the same time that the Mothman appeared, there was a lot of UFO activity in the town of Point Pleasant. And the Men in Black turned up, menacing people, even threatening local reporters working in the offices late at night in the local newspaper. And again, they were described as weird little guys, about 5 foot to 5'5" tall, skin, like the color of white paint. Again, not really understanding our mannerisms and customs, but also seeming very menacing for reasons that people didn't really understand. I mean, one classically creepy case involved a local journalist named Maury Island, and she said this MIB, again, one of these little milk white-faced guys, came into the office late at night when she was working alone and just sort of stood right in front of her and sort of, right in her space, so to speak. And basically said, what would you do if somebody told you not to talk about flying saucers? And she said, I'd tell him to go to hell. And she couldn't help but notice that he kept his eye all the time on her ballpoint pen. And he suddenly snatched it up off the table and gave out this sort of weird, eerie cackle and sort of ran out the door into the night, which is a very sort of menacingly weird and funny story at the same time. But it all sort of got very tragic and disastrous because at the height of all these encounters, the Point Pleasant Silver Bridge, which spans the Ohio River and joins West Virginia to Ohio, collapsed. This was in the Christmas period, and there were literally dozens of cars on the bridge, and somewhere I think in the region of 40 people were killed when the bridge collapsed. So you have, again, this run of bad luck that follows encounters with the MIB, and you have crossovers between the UFO subject and the whole cryptozoological thing as well. So, that's what makes the the Mothman story so fascinating, because it has all these different aspects to it, and, it sort of pummeled the area for a couple of years.
So obviously, you've steeped yourself in the MIB lore as much as any layperson could ever hope to, and you've gone above and beyond, I guess, as a paranormal cryptozoological investigator. I was wondering, personally, what would you recount as the most terrifying MIB story that you've ever read or heard of?
Oh, wow. That's really put me on the spot. Let me just have a think for it. Well, what I would say first is that, there probably isn't an MIB story that, from the witness's perspective, isn't sort of terrifying and menacing, because I think that's the whole point of the experience, is to instill fear and terror in the witness. Now, one of the stories that I would say is certainly near the top of the list, my list, because it's one I investigated personally, involved a friend of mine named Marie Jones. And Marie's a well-known paranormal author. She's written a lot of very good books on a whole range of sort of supernatural phenomena. And she began investigating some alien abduction stories in the 1980s. She lives on the West Coast in San Diego. And she and a friend of hers began getting MIB-type visitations. A friend lived in an isolated area, and she reported seeing these sort of weird, coming back to robots, actually like robotic figures with these stiff legs in black suits who would sort of wander or lurk on the edges of the property. It was like a wooded area, but close enough to where her friend could see them, which was probably the point, and, it put a lot of fear into her. Now, Marie didn't see the MIB, but she got these weird phone calls late at night, literally wake her up from a dead sleep at like 2 a.m. And it would just be a voice on the end of the phone telling her what book was on the bookside table she was reading, 5 hours before or whatever. Again, just to, I guess, instill fear and paranoia in Marie. And this went on for a long time, to where both Marie and her friend backed away from the whole abduction subject, and then the MIB experiences stopped. But this for me is sort of very creepy when you're getting phone calls from somebody who's telling you what's on your bedside table, even what book you were reading, and then you've got these sort of stiff-legged, shadowy, dark clothed entities shuffling through the woods outside your house. It sounds like something straight out of H.P. Lovecraft until you realize it's actually real.
Really compromise your sense of security.
Yeah, so I guess Marie's is sort of a very weird and unsettling one, I guess.
That actually is really creepy, and I'm a huge H.P. Lovecraft fan, as is Ryan. So that's
well, I was just going to say, you can look at Lovecraft's work from the perspective that a lot of it dealt with the existence of other realms and magical beings that could enter our world. Not to go down a paranoid path, but Lovecraft himself was beset by ill health and died young.
Do you know that there's actually a school of thought that there was a real Necronomicon, like not the one that he wrote, but that he had, like there had existed at some point a real book on the Necronomicon, and they're all destroyed. But
yeah, I mean, that's sort of, for people. I mean, I'm quite into Lovecraft stuff as well. That is sort of a staple part of it. The idea that he was writing fictional stories, but based on, real truths that he presented as a story. But he kind of fictionalized it, so it became like faction, so to speak.
Well, I certainly hope that, as interesting as I find it, that it is all fiction, because I don't know what I'd do if Cthulhu, risen up from the ocean or something like that. So, with all that being said, Nick, we're getting at the end of our show here. Is there anything that you'd like to let our listeners know, like your books and websites and stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. Well, people can reach me. I have a blog, which is Nick Redfern 14, FORTEAN. .blogspot.com. People can reach me there, or at Facebook. I'm always pleased to chat with people. I'm not one of these snobby people who says, "Oh, I'm an author, leave me alone." I'm always pleased to chat and share views. And people got stories they want to tell. If they want answers, that's fine. And I've got a new book out in May, which is called The Monster Files. And it's a study of what government agencies know about things like Bigfoot and lake monsters and werewolves and strange creatures, where they've actually opened files on sort of bizarre beasts of the planet, so to speak.
Well, Nick, thanks a lot for coming on to the show. I mean, very, very interesting stuff. It was really I've been looking forward to doing a Men in Black episode for a long time, and I can't think of anyone better that we could have had on the show to do it. So thanks so much for coming on. And
thank you very much from myself as well, Nick.
All right. Well, thanks, guys, and thanks for having me on the show.
You're very welcome. It's our pleasure. And for everyone else listening out there, if you have your own effed up story, video, pictures, or anything of that nature, you can actually go to our official website at www.effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. Go into the menu and click on submissions. A very simple, easy to follow submission form where you can submit your stuff for a chance to have it on our website or in our podcasts, or possibly even get you as a guest on our show. And with that said, thank you everyone for listening. And this is Will signing out.
And this is Ryan Sharp signing out.